First of all, thank you to all of you for coming out this evening. We're really honored and excited to have a full house again. And of course, thank you to our exhibition sponsors. In particular, thank you to the Inasmuch Foundation and George Records, who are presenting partners for this exhibition. Now I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Leah Lehmbeck. Dr. Leah Lehmbeck is curator and department head of European painting and sculpture and American art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Her most recent exhibitions include To Rome and Back, Individualism and Authority in Art, 1500 to 1800, in 2018, City of Cinema, Paris, 1850 to 1907, co-curated with Britt Salveson in 2022, and I'm very upset that I missed that exhibition. It sounds wonderful. The LACMA presentation of Another World, the Transcendental Painting Group, 1938 to 1945, which opened last year, and of course the exhibition that you all came to see tonight, True Nature, Rodin and the Age of Impressionism, for which she did an absolutely fantastic job. Dr. Lehmbeck has lectured and written widely across her field, serving as editor and or author for many publications, among which the most recent are Manet and Modern Beauty, the artist's last years, the 3-volume catalog, Gifts of European Art from the Amundsen Foundation, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Carter collection of Dutch paintings, and City of Cinema, Paris, 1850 to 1907. She has represented the curatorial team in planning discussions for the museum's new building for the permanent collection and has led efforts to secure partnerships to display LACMA's sculpture collections around Los Angeles County. She holds a Bachelor of Arts from Columbia University, a PhD from NYU, and she's a big Dodgers fan and already made a pilgrimage to the Oklahoma City AAA Dodgers. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Dr. Leah Lehmbeck.
First, I just want to thank you all so much for coming tonight. It's so wonderful to see such a beautiful crowd, to see all of the garlands in the crowd. What are those for? They look so good. They're what? They're just, no, they're just so beautiful. And I want to thank the staff here, Michael, of course, Brian, who's been such a great host, and Rosie May, who took me around today, and we got to look at the permanent collection as well as the show. And the show looks beautiful here, and it's a testament to your staff, really, truly. It looks so wonderful. So thank you so much for having me. And so we will begin. I think there's time for questions after this, right? Okay, so I'll talk, and then you'll ask, and we'll go from there. Rodin is one of those artists whose work nearly everyone recognizes. Like Leonardo, Michelangelo, Van Gogh, and Picasso, Rodin's work has been absorbed seamlessly into the canon of Western art history. Like Picasso, who never fully made an abstract painting, but whose artistic choices can be seen to lead the way to the abstract experiments to follow, so too can Rodin's work, which never crossed the boundary into the fully abstract, be seen as a link between the art of the 19th century and that of the artistic journeys explored in the art of the 20th. Rodin's biography, and significantly the myth of the artist created around him and perpetuated relentlessly by him, helped solidify his reputation during his lifetime. He was a ceaseless self-promoter, an any press is good press kind of guy. And as we sit here now, a little over 100 years after the artist's death, his work seems to remain integral to our collective cultural consciousness. Of course, one of the fun ways to measure that is how much the artist is parodied. We can get the joke only if we truly know the artist and his work. Okay, certainly his relationships, remaining unmarried to his longtime mistress Rose Beret until 6 days before his death, to his on-again, off-again relationship with the artist Camille Claudel, have much to do with the perception of Rodin as a virile, masculine maker of art. His deep feeling for his craft, his creative torment, if you will, a characterization which, again, was perpetuated both by others and by the man himself, cemented his perception as the tortured artistic genius. His artistic output, however, is far more nuanced than this characterization. The success of Rodin's work can instead be found elsewhere, across the many artistic boundaries he fluidly crossed. He is easily characterized as a classicist in his commitment to the tension bound to the narrative tales of the past, as a romantic due to his presentation of powerful emotions through the expression of physical form, evidenced most strongly in his sustained engagement with portraiture, and as a naturalist, given his profound consideration of the accuracy of movement and his focus on the physical, sensual possibilities drawn from the sinew and skeleton of the human body. Stripped of his biographical scaffolding, we are left to consider the degree to which the diversity of Rodin's approaches sustain the narrative of his artistic success. Through this exhibition, an examination of a large selection of his works and those of his contemporaries, Rodin's varied artistic concerns are on view, and they reveal powerful conceptual and formal challenges with the art of his past and present that link him indisputably to the art of the future. It is only through the work itself where his success can ultimately be laid bare. Rodin's relationship with Western classicism is as varied as the subject matter and stylistic explorations that emerged in antiquity, from ancient Greek to imperial Roman artistic practice. He collected antiquities and studied from plaster casts, and through this rigorous examination was able to absorb the tenets of classicism that appealed most to his artistic sensibilities. More specifically, Rodin's two most important engagements with the art of the past occurred outside of France during the early part of his career. First, in Italy in 1876 and later in London in 1881. The Italian trip introduced him to Roman antiquities as well as to the work of the early modern masters, particularly Michelangelo, who he considered his master and idol. He used those words. In London, Rodin went specifically to visit the 5th century BC Greek Parthenon frieze, in which human strength and movement are paramount. These encounters reinforced his quest for the same power in his own art. While moving forward in his contemporary milieu, he continuously re-engaged with models from millennia earlier. After training and apprenticing for years, and after many public failures, Rodin won his first major commission in 1880 at the old age of 40 for a massive portal for the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, a decorative arts museum that was in fact never built. While the project was not cast in bronze in his lifetime, Rodin nevertheless continued to work on the gates of hell, as the portal would come to be known, until the end of his career. He relentlessly added, altered, studied, and restudied some 200 figures related to the content of the doors, dozens of which fed his creative life in the 37 years following the commission. The figures on Rodin's massive doors are drawn largely from the Inferno, the first part of Dante's medieval epic poem, The Divine Comedy, which was read with renewed vigor in the 19th century. The poem recounts Dante's voyage through the underworld, led by the ancient author Virgil, and the literary work is itself a reinterpretation of several classical motifs. Given the length of the project and the complexity of its relationship to the original text, Rodin remarked that, quote, although the door is generally understood as an illustration of Dante's Inferno, it is only true to a limited degree. Regardless of its honesty to the original text, the scenes and figures writhe and pulsate as they emerge in and out of the plane of the unbuilt threshold. I don't know if you have seen this up close. If you have an opportunity at some point, Philadelphia, Paris, maybe, it's extraordinary to see how deep and how far out the figures go. Rodin's approach to the two lovers, Paolo and Francesca, for example, shows such dynamism, representing the struggle of their punishment when they were forever condemned to the second circle of hell for betraying Francesca's husband, Paolo's brother. And while so many of the figures on the portal push, pull, strive, and strain, the fallen caryatid with urn is one composition that provides a moment of respite within the multitude of vignettes of anguish. The figure is not tensed by burden, nor fighting against the weight of her urn. Rather, the smooth handling of the figure, the stasis of the pose, and the figure's resting eyes signify a melancholy and sadness. In addition to the dozens of designs emerging and submerging into the nearly 20-foot tall portal, Several compositions developed during Rodin's work on the project never made it into the grand doors. Indeed, these designs were conceived and ultimately developed as freestanding sculpture. The Aeneid was one such composition. The subject was adapted from the classical story of the daughters of Danaus, whose punishment for killing their husbands on their wedding night was the endlessly futile task of gathering water with broken vessels. In Rodin's version of this story, a female collapses in exhaustion and submission to her punishment. Her depleted posture, a smooth arc contrasting the rough nature of the rock on which she lies, not only marks Rodin's successful handling of the physical form, but emphasizes his interest in light, which necessarily reflects off the two opposing surfaces in different ways. Not incidentally, when the figure was carved in marble, it was first on exhibition in 1889 alongside works of Claude Monet, a friend and fellow artist deeply interested in capturing the transient effects of light. Whereas Rodin's engagement with classical narratives necessarily meant a focus on historical material, the sculptor's sustained interest in the potential of portraiture was directed towards both contemporary and historical figures. Rodin's quest to render a satisfactory likeness developed over the course of his career, and with his increased reputation came greater artistic freedom to define what a portrait should convey. Rodin valued representing specific individuals for the challenge of evoking his subject's psychology and emotional state, from humble neighbors to famed authors. Rodin's belief in the power of physiognomy to reveal one's inner character is reflected in his comment that, quote, "The artist has only to look into a human face in order to read there the soul within. Not a feature deceives him. The line of a forehead, the least lifting of a brow, the flash of an eye reveal to him all the secrets of a heart." Now, in an earlier phase of his career, Rodin produced idealized and easily saleable portrait busts, particularly after joining the studio of the commercially popular sculptor Albert Carrier-Belleuse in 1864. Together, the two sculptors worked on major commissions as well as small figurines, and later became part of a large community of Parisian exiles who left the besieged French capital and fled to Brussels during the Franco-Prussian War. Their professional relationship ended shortly after their move in 1871 amidst a dispute over Rodin's desired artistic independence. Nevertheless, while working in Carrier-Belleuse's workshop and unable to claim the rights to many of the models he produced in this period, Rodin attempted to sell sculptures in the manner of Cézanne, under his own name. Sculpted in the style of the elder artist, whose work adhered far more directly to academic tradition than his own, Rodin's faithful recreation of Carrier-Belleuse's idealizing mode demonstrates the relative ease with which Rodin could master different sculptural styles. Gradually, Rodin would develop a distinct style of portraiture that expressed the spirit of his subject through dynamic movement and abstraction. Rodin returned to Paris from Brussels in 1877, and in the French capital he garnered increasing renown through a series of major commissions, some successful, some less so. In 1884, the city of Calais invited several artists, among them Rodin, to design a monumental public sculpture commemorating 6 prominent citizens who offered to sacrifice themselves in exchange for King Edward III's cessation of a siege on the city in the 100 Years' War. This 14th century tale of patriotic sacrifice held resonance in Rodin's time as the siege of Paris in the Franco-Prussian War remained fresh in the national memory. Rodin defied conventions of traditional monument making by representing all of the burghers embarking from the city of Calais toward their death, rather than isolating the more obvious moment of heroism when Eustache de Saint-Pierre, the leader of the 6 burghers, stepped forward to volunteer himself as sacrifice. A group portrait, Rodin used the opportunity of the 500-year-old event to shift the focus from the invented physical attributes to the complexity of the burghers' psychological states. Each of their bodies expressed a different response to their anguish. Some of the burghers remained stoic, while others expressed the gravity of their heroism by taking their head in their hands or throwing their arms open in distress. Upon seeing Rodin's model, the committee from Calais criticized the sculptor for rendering the burghers' suffering as, quote, painfully real, when they expected an image of an idealized martyrdom. The city ultimately accepted the monument, which was completed in 1889 and installed in Calais in 1895. In 1891, after the Burgers was complete, but before it was installed, the Société des Gens de Lettres, an independent organization for writers, gave Rodin 18 months to complete a monument to the late playwright and novelist Honoré de Balzac, one of its founders. Completely disregarding the time requirements for the commission, Rodin spent the next 7 years working and reworking studies of the subject. He became obsessed with researching the author, assembling records of his appearance, and listening to firsthand accounts of his character. He was so dedicated to the subject that he solicited precise measurements of Balzac from the author's former tailor, and actually had him remake a coat fitting the deceased writer. The commission proved to be more difficult and laborious than even the Burgers of Calais, as the Société was unhappy with the sculptor's tremendously slow and obsessive working process. Rodin worked through his monument in several stages, each a step towards achieving a satisfactory portrait. His process began with producing a number of smaller sculptures that explored the expressive potential of Balzac's signature Dominican robe. These studies were favored by the commissioning committee because the robe conjured associations with the author's notorious marathon writing sessions, in which he was known to have worked obsessively through the night while wearing only a large, flowing monk's robe. In this version at left, Rodin uncrosses the writer's arms, opening him up to the viewer with his shoulders back, chest out, and his right hand resting on a manuscript. This posture, together with his raised chin and his hand on his hip, give Balzac the air of a conqueror, a traditional sculptural typology befitting a monumental public sculpture. In his next series of studies, Rodin represented the author nude. He resolved the compositional challenges posed by Balzac's short, stout physique by giving him a powerful stance akin to the wide-set posture of an orator. These studies effectively convey the author's robustness and virility. For the final sculpture, Rodin chose to represent Balzac clothed, but dramatically manipulated his swirling robe to suggest the writer's intellectual vitality, with the bulge at his waist an undeniable indicator of the link he saw between masculinity and creative strength. The sculpture also speaks to the qualities with which Rodin himself identified and cultivated, the figure of the productive, masculine, confident genius. Unlike the city of Calais, who ultimately accepted his work, the Société was never satisfied and they rejected Rodin's final plaster in 1898. In the wake of the monument's critical failure, Parisian artists publicly came to Rodin's defense, spreading news in the press, both at home and abroad, about the artistic merits of the work. The plaster was moved to the artist's home in Meudon outside of Paris, where other artists made pilgrimages to see it. In the end, Balzac was not cast in bronze until 1939, when it was installed at the intersections of the boulevards Montparnasse and Raspail. Despite its official rejection, however, the monument to Honoré de Balzac became an essential part of Rodin's mythos as an artist devoted to capturing the spiritual core of his subjects. It also came to stand in as a marker for his own creative success. In the scandal surrounding the sculpture's reception, or non-reception, as the case may be, its defenders lauded it as an avant-garde masterpiece. The young American photographer Edward Steichen was among those admirers who read about the scandal in a newspaper in Milwaukee, where he had begun work as a lithographer. Upon seeing the picture of Balzac in the paper, Steichen remarked years later, the sculpture, quote, seemed the most wonderful thing I had ever seen. It was not just the statue of a man, it was the very embodiment of a tribute to genius. It looked like a mountain come to life. It stirred up my interest in going to Paris, where artists of Rodin's stature lived and worked. Steichen traveled to Paris in 1900 to see the famous sculpture, but during that visit was too shy to meet with the artist. He later returned and developed a long friendship with the sculptor. He also continued to be inspired by the Balzac, which he was able to photograph several years later in the moonlight at Rodin's home in Meudon. And this was a real breakthrough also in photography. The sculptor was profoundly moved by Steichen's haunting photographs, telling him, quote, "It is Christ walking in the wilderness. Your photographs will make the world understand my Balzac." Until 1900, Rodin's dramatic approaches to the human figure were best known through his large public commissions, which received both praise and criticism in the press. While the critics' chief concerns revolved around the unfinished nature of the work, the unrefined surface, and the non-traditional approach to subject matter, his supporters praised the sculptor's relentless quest in capturing the lifelike movement and energy of the physical form. The monumental sculptors embodied these qualities, and yet they are also evident in his most intimate works. And I put the dims on these so you could see how small they are if you haven't been upstairs yet. While the small sculptures speak perhaps with less assertiveness than a life-size bronze, they nevertheless pronounce just as clearly Rodin's concerns with the expressive potential of the figure. Rodin's exhibition schedule in the burgeoning Parisian dealer system, as well as his participation in state-sponsored exhibitions, allowed for his more modest sculptures to be shared with the public from time to time. However, it was his enormous exhibition at the Pavillon de l'Alma in Paris, an annex of sorts of the 1900 World's Fair, which was arguably his greatest opportunity to connect with the public directly and to share with them the full range of his work. Marketed with a poster designed by his friend Eugène Carrière, whose image also graced the cover of the catalog, over 300,000 visitors came through the show. I'm sorry about the blurriness, but these are very old photos, and they're not scanned very high on the internet where I could get them. The Gates of Hell were the centerpiece, on public view for the first time, and they were accompanied by an extraordinary 165 sculptures, in addition to a room of drawings and photographs. One of many Americans to visit was Daniel Chester French, a highly important sculptor in the United States at the time. His impression of the show likely led to the first dedicated gallery to a contemporary artist anywhere in America, a room dedicated in 1912 to Rodin at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Visitors commented on the installation as, quote, "penetrating light covering marbles and plasters to create an impression of freshness and repose," and on the other hand, to, quote, "that the whole place seemed to be held in a thinly lit, chill silence of horror, coldness and terror emanating from the marbles that writhe and clutch in frozen poses of frenzy on every side." A significant subgroup of the many visitors included several prominent artists who were profoundly affected by the exhibition. Among them were Henri Matisse and Aristide Maillol, both of whom began to experiment with sculpture after visiting the monumental exhibition, as well as the then 18-year-old Pablo Picasso, who made the trip from Spain. During the run of the exhibition from June to November, several works were acquired or new ones commissioned, cementing its financial success. But more importantly, it justified the 60-year-old Rodin's artistic practice. Of the exhibition's meaning to him, Rodin declared it, quote, "a moral outcome." Beyond the general frenzy surrounding the exhibition in its 5-month run, the show served as a showcase of several of Rodin's smaller works that had not been easily accessed by the public. Among these was Invocation, which at the time was exhibited in plaster, as with nearly all of the other works which we saw in the photograph. They were not yet in bronze. It's very important to remember that it was a very expensive process to get the work from plaster to bronze. And so most of the sculpture that was shown by artists at the time was white. It was plaster. Rodin's choices in the position of this figure in particular, specifically the way in which the arms are upraised, the torso twists, and the legs bend, contribute to a surprisingly multifaceted view of the composition. From the frontal view at left, she looks as though she is about to stand, and her left arm hides her face. As you move around to the right, the musculature of her arms and her clenching right fist showcase her strength. And from the rear, which is the image at right, there's an almost magical appearance of negative space. A heart materializes between two upraised hands. Triangular tunnels appear between the legs. that together lend a lightness to the form. These careful manipulations to the composition illuminate Rodin's interest in the dynamic possibilities of the body and of the opportunities that can be revealed from its careful arrangement. Rodin's explorations of the far-ranging possibilities of the human body are not just manifest in his depictions of the whole figure, but also in his focused consideration of its parts, torsos, heads, and especially hands. In large clenched hand, two partial figures come together. The torso is derived from female centaur, another sculpture by him, with her hands likely borrowed from another male figure, while the large masculine swollen hand which faces the torsos was a new form for the sculptor at this time. The deliberate mix of scale and gender, coupled with its uneven finish, suggests the work may have been a study or an experiment. And as with invocation, different views grant different meanings. Seen from the side, the separation between the figures in hand reaffirm the discordance of scale and gender. But seen from behind, as we shift our gaze behind the torso, the female figure appears to be caught in a moment of pushing, kind of successfully, the looming hand away. The diminutive torso resists the overbearing power of the masculine hand. Now, by 1900, Rodin was nearly 60 years old, and he had established decades-long dialogue with many painters. The catalog for his show that year reflects his integration into his artistic community, as the cover featured the image by Carrière, as we just saw, and included artist statements by Carrière, Jean-Paul Laurens, Claude Monet, and Albert Bernard. Notably, they were all painters. The sculptor's relationship with Monet, however, was one of his longest and most sustained. Given Rodin's late artistic start and his career in Belgium for most of the 1870s, it was not until the 1880s that Monet and Rodin, born within 2 days of one another, actually met. And by this time, Monet had sort of gone through some success, some perilous financial situations, and was kind of like on the rise. Now, Monet was already, as I mentioned, he was an established leader of the avant-garde, but he was fighting to be recognized outside of the traditional painting system and exhibiting with the Impressionists outside of the government-sponsored exhibitions such as the Salon, as well as taking advantage of the new dealer showrooms, including those belonging to the influential Paul Durand-Ruel and Georges Petit galleries. Petit's capacious exhibition rooms housed several group shows in the mid-1880s, placing Rodin's sculptures among work by the painters Monet and Renoir, and later Camille Pissarro and Alfred Sisley, among others. In 1889, the year the Eiffel Tower was built for the World's Fair preceding the 1900 World's Fair, just Monet and Rodin were paired together for an exhibition, and I write more about this relationship in the 1889 sort of moment in the little catalog that we made for this exhibition. Essentially, the exhibition was a retrospective of Monet's career with nearly 150 paintings. Rodin was represented with 36 of his sculptures, including the Burghers of Calais and several smaller sculptures, such as Danaid. Monet's focus was on landscapes, and his paintings from Giverny were meditations on the fields and poplars of this quiet town that would ultimately become Monet's home. The picture on the right, unfortunately, couldn't travel. It's a little too fragile for us to send it out, but I'm including it here just so you see. The landscape elements of Woods at Giverny are not dissimilar to the works that would have been on display in the 1889 exhibition. The focus on pattern, the negative space between the leaves, and the contraction of depth reinforced by the tree trunks continuing beyond the picture plane suggests Monet's shift from an interest solely in the play of light into one of examining spatial depth. Of the Impressionists, though, it was perhaps the work of Renoir who Rodin admired the most. His relationship with Monet was not an easy one, let's put it that way. It was not Renoir's avant-garde explorations that most interested Rodin, however. Notably, it was the painter's return to linearity and naturalism, accomplished mostly after 1890, to which Rodin was drawn. Rodin owned at least 3 works by the painter, 2 of which were nudes. The admiration between painter and sculptor was mutual, as Renoir referred to Rodin simply as, quote, the greatest sculptor. Now, whereas Rodin had the most visible public exchange with the Impressionists through their oft-shared dealer spaces, the sculptor sustained connections with a variety of artists and their differing stylistic approaches. Rodin was certainly drawn to the emotionally suggestive photographs of Psyche and paintings of Carrière, as well as to pictures by Theodore Ribot and Vincent van Gogh, all of whose work Rodin actually collected. By the turn of the century, Rodin's influence was so great that across Europe and America, he had made his mark beyond his contemporaries and on a younger generation of avant-garde painters and sculptors, among them Matisse, Picasso, and Constantine Brancusi, a young Romanian peasant who crossed Europe on foot, apparently, driven by the inspiration Paris promised to provide. Now, after Rodin met Brancusi, he invited the young sculptor to work in his atelier. Brancusi declined, stating famously, quote, "Nothing grows in the shade of a tall tree." In the end, it is through a direct and careful examination of Rodin's work where his triumphs are revealed. His vast and varied approaches to art making, with dedicated interests in naturalism and classicism and romanticism, are the foundations from which Rodin's artistic successes emerge. And throughout these ostensibly contradictory, even competing modes of interest, arise together from his three-dimensional work a physical and emotional power that resonated in his time and beyond. While Rodin's success was certainly aided by the voices that helped perpetuate the myths surrounding the artist, it is through the undeniably compelling language of his work that continues to have significance in our time. Questions, anybody? No? I answered all of them? Okay. Sorry, you want to pick? Who? Sure, I will repeat the question. In the red on the end.
Be your favorite impressionist and sculptor relationship?
Ooh. Who would be my favorite impressionist, like painter and sculptor relationship at that time? That's an interesting question because Rodin was, as you see up in the galleries, not the only sculptor in the late 19th and early 20th century. He was just the one who perpetuated. I mean, he just got so much attention and sought it out, and also was so deliberate in his sort of self-promotion that he's the one that everybody talks about. And I mean, I am interested because I wrote about it, the Rodin-Monet connection. But it's an interesting question because I do think there are more relationships beyond those that happened because it was, I mean, while the art world was big, it wasn't that big at the time, and sort of everybody knew everything. But this was really probably that one is the most sustained over time, and the one we have like the most archival information about because of the press and the sort of popularity of both of them at the time. In the pink, yeah.
I noticed in the museum he did a number of sculptures on Victor Hugo. Were they contemporaries or did they have a relationship?
Victor Hugo died, I don't remember when, but in the late 19th century. I'm not sure that they knew each other personally, but he was in awe of most of the creative folks that were in and around them, especially those that were French, like Zola and Mallarmé, etc., who were writing at the time. He considered himself very much a creative person, and that I mean that in the broadest sense, not just a sculptor, not just a fine artist. So he's got Hugo in sculpting form. He has Hugo in etching form, I think, in drawing form also. I'm trying to think if there's others, actually. I mean, his obsession with Balzac was well known, but I don't know if he did a Mallarmé. He might have, or Zola. I feel like all of them did. Manet had a bunch of Monet and Mallarmé, and yeah. Anyways, just to say he's part of the community. Yes?
I'm curious to know how the LA County Museum managed to amass such a large collection of Rodins.
This is such a good question. Okay, so I have a second lecture that I didn't give tonight because this is a kind of intro lecture, but I have a lecture that I give on Rodin and America and how this happened. It starts at the very beginning, like with Steichen, with Daniel Chester French going to and starting the sort of love for Rodin across the Atlantic. A number of Americans went to France around that time, wealthy Americans who were starting to collect art in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So you start to see them buying this material. And there's a sort of second wave of those Americans who come to sort of the mid-century, the mid-20th century, with those same ideals in mind, kind of in love with the French avant-garde of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And one of them is B. Gerald Cantor. And he sets up this foundation where he collects hundreds of Rodins, and he starts giving them away to institutions across the United States. And LACMO is the beneficiary. We are not the only one. If you have been to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you know there's a Cantor sculpture garden on the roof. They have an enormous number of Cantor sculptures there, which are almost all Rodin. They're not exclusively Rodin, but they're Rodin and his sculpting contemporaries. And if you look on the credit lines upstairs, you'll see that most of them come from Gerald or Iris Cantor. There's Cantor sculpture gardens in most major cities, I feel like. And one in the United States, there's a major one at Stanford up at in Northern California. There's ours. There's New York. They're around. And so that's happened. It starts at the very beginning, though. It's contemporary with Rodin and his making, and continues through the 20th century.
I'm interested in understanding how Rodin's influence continued into the 21st century process.
Well, so the question was, how does Rodin's influence continue in the 20th century? It's interesting. He goes in and out of favor in the 20th century. So, you know, in the early part of the 20th century, we see these the young sort of modernists, if you will, Matisse and Picasso, learning from him, seeing him, getting inspired by him, etc. And then there's a kind of moment where he becomes enormously out of fashion due to the fact that he's making representational art, and a lot of the avant-garde see that as kind of retardataire. And then there's a moment where that all comes back, and he begins to be appreciated for that kind of staunch, the sort of holding on to the figural and the emotive power of the body, etc. So it's like, it goes like this over time. And what's interesting now is I think I feel like in the last couple of years, there've been a couple of Rodin exhibitions, and I wonder if it's a kind of grounding that we return to, because we feel, I always believe that we feel connected to this time because it's of our moment. It seems like a long time ago, but it's like, it's when their first movie theaters, and it's when their first malls come out, and where you can go shopping, and it's all of our time. And the art made at that time feels familiar in a way. And also because Americans collected it from the beginning, so we've seen it, over and over again. It's in our museums, etc. And I do feel that like maybe now is one of those times where we're returning to that feeling of groundedness, etc. I don't know. It's pop psychology. Well, it's a guess. Okay, way in the back, because I feel like you've had your hand up for a while.
I was wondering about the selection process for the Burgers of Calais, because he was one of the number, and then the committee did like his plaster.
Yeah.
Did everybody submit a plasters, or what was the first thing that allowed him to be chosen?
Yeah. So he was chosen before finished his giant multi-figural plaster. And I don't actually know the details of what the, if it went down to 3 people and they performed small plasters, because often what would happen is you would provide a maquette of some kind, a small plaster, not the giant one, and present it as a kind of, where you were headed piece. Calais eventually said okay, but it's I don't actually know the details of how rough the sketch was when he first showed it, and then when he went back to work on it and showed them again, what the nature of that was. You can be sure, however, that during the process they would have seen some vision of it, and that was true for the Balzac also. Like the Société was checking in on him and getting more and more frustrated as the 18 months turned into 7 years. In the back, in the reserve, behind the reserve seat, with the beard. You, yes.
Yes, I noticed in our travels we seem to find more than one version of the burgers of Calais, and I wondered, is that fairly common that these places, that there were more than one of the sculptures available, and how they came to be?
So did you hear the question? Was how are there multiples out there? Well, you will see. I mean, it's the same version, but there are multiples of it. This is about the burghers of Calais, and it's the same goes for the Thinker, which you've seen around, and etc. These are all cast in bronze, so there's a number of them. There's a finite number of them that are authorized in any case. Some were done in Rodin's lifetime, and some the Foundation have done. The Foundation, which is now also runs the Rodin Museum in Paris, if you have ever been. And they've authorized casts throughout the 20th century, but there's a finite number of them. And this is a very good question, because it comes to ask, is it his if he's long gone and we have the model and it's cast by a bronze foundry? Like, we ask that question. I'm not going to tell you yes or no, but we ask that question. It's important to ask that question. And the same goes for the Degas bronzes up there, because Degas never, ever cast a bronze in his lifetime. So different from Rodin, who did cast in his lifetime, but Degas never once cast anything in bronze. And we think of Degas and his dancers as bronze, but they were wax in his lifetime, and it's only posthumously where they were all cast in bronze and made into multiples. So this is a question we deal with when we deal with sculpture of this kind all the time, is, okay, where does the artist begin? Where does the craft begin? Where does it end? Where does the creative spirit? Is it okay? I mean, these are all questions for you to answer. I'm not going to tell you. And because there isn't a right answer to that, it's a question of, if we think of, there is also a great skill in bronze casting, and some are better than others. And so if there's an entity that's overlooking that, or an artist that's overlooking that, is it different, etc.? Yeah. Yes?
I have a question about this picture. I'm curious about it. I've never seen the Pantheon in Paris, but I know the picture was originally in front of that. Is that the Pantheon? That's where his funeral was?
This is at Moudon, I think. Oh, no. Is this the Pantheon? No, this isn't the Pantheon. I thought that this was in Moudon, actually, which is outside of Paris. But if anybody... Yeah. I think it was taken at Moudon. I think his funeral was in Moudon. Can anybody fact check me on that? Google. Somebody can Google it. Yeah, somebody can Google it. Yes, in the blue.
How did Rodin learn about figures, sculpture, and why is it not considered pornographic?
How did he learn about the figure, and why is it not considered pornographic? Okay, so the first question is, he learned about the figure by study of classical casting and school. I mean, he went to art school. And in fact, there's a little story that I didn't get into that where in one of his first nude sculptures of a man walking like this, he was accused of casting from life. And he was horrified. He went toe to toe with the critic who accused him of this in the Parisian papers, etc., because he was saying how, no, I know what I'm doing. I would never do such a thing. That's cheating, kind of thing. Now, why is he not considered pornographic? I think that really depends on who you ask. And it changes throughout time. And in the late 19th century when he was doing it, there were certainly people who thought so, as there are now. So, and some things are way more explicit than others, where our various bars are, where we cross those lines. And drawings, certainly, he have very explicit drawings that are not in this exhibition, because we don't actually have them in our collection, but yeah. So I think that's just a matter of taste. But I think it also comes from the fact that he was a male artist with a lot of eyes on him at the time, and sort of perpetuating certain myths about sexuality, virility, and artistic creation. So it's all part of a piece. Yes?
I thought, and this was just an assumption on my part, that he chose to work with the mythological creatures or subjects in order to be able to explore the body in his sculptures and do so and not get away with it with the censors.
Right, without getting into trouble. That's sometimes a method that not just he used at the time. I'm not sure how conscious that effort was. I'm sure he thought he would get more of maybe a pass, but I don't know if that's why he did the Gates of Hell the way he did them. But it's true. I mean, if you look at art over the 500 years up to Rodin, there's a kind of explicit nature that's allowed for when it's couched in classical mythology, that if it were a contemporary portrait, nobody would tolerate. So, yeah. Yes?
Can you speak to the process, how fortunate we are to have this exhibit here, but how it came to be here?
Certainly. So one of the questions is, can I speak to the process of this exhibition? So LACMA is undergoing a transformation. We are... Oh, yay! Oh, fantastic. We have a member here. Oh, great. So LACMA is undergoing a transformation on their campus in terms of a new building. And we have, for those of you, and I'm assuming many, have never been there, there are multiple buildings. It's kind of campus. And there were a couple new buildings built within the last 10 or 15 years that serve as our exhibition pavilions. And then there was a series of buildings that really housed our permanent collection. And the permanent collection buildings we tore down, and we're building one big new one. Now, while that happens, and this happens everywhere when they're building a new building, or they have to close we have to close the museum. In this case, we didn't have to close the whole thing because we still had our exhibition pavilions open and we're rotating permanent collection through there. But we were asked as curators if we could come up with traveling exhibitions. Now, this was in 2017, okay? And if you know anything about museum time, which is kind of like geological time, you're planning 3, 4, 5 years out in advance. And in this case, I thought, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to get the Rodins out, because they're usually in our garden outside. And we don't move them. The other stuff moves around, the small sculptures certainly, but not the big ones. And I thought, well, this is great. This is the only time these are going to be crated up and in storage. So we put that together, and then March 2020 came and exploded every calendar of every museum I know. And so we shuffled a bunch of things, basically, and then reshuffled this tour even, because I think it was supposed to start in like 2020. And just things, yeah, it was like everything else, it just exploded. the calendar. And so this is how it came about. So it was basically, this material falls into one of my departments. My department of European painting and sculpture is antiquities, Western antiquities, and basically everything from medieval to 1900 in Europe. And so we catch the tail end of it with the late 19th century material. Yeah. Yeah.
How do Rodin's works influence today's artists?
Oof. I don't know that they do. That's a good question. You'd have to ask a bunch of artists. I mean, there's so many artists working now, I can't possibly speak for them. I would imagine people who are looking at figural art of the past, Rodin is one of those greats in the history of Western art that's sort of hard to miss. But I don't know of any who are particularly looking at Rodin like specifically. But my guess is, contemporary artists get their inspiration from everywhere, art history and not, yeah. Yes.
How did you get to Oklahoma City? Did we inquire? Did they come from you? Where did they come from?
The show? Okay, so how did I get to Oklahoma City? Well, I got here on an airplane yesterday. But so what happens when we do these shows, at least on LACMA's side, is we'll put together a kind of package that says this is what the show is going to look like. This is how many square feet it needs. This is the insurance value on it. This is the kind of, concerns that it has, whatever they are logistically. And we usually send it out to, people we know, friends of the institution. And by that, I just mean institutions we worked with in the past, institutions we know that don't have Rodin. We do a little research to see, what's in the neighborhood, what's at the institution, who could afford it, depending on what it is. Because, to ensure things like this is not a small feat. And so thank you again to your funders for this exhibition, because the Impressionist material in particular is very expensive to hold in this building. So we do that, and then we see who comes back and who's interested. So the show was in Florida before it was here. And the more you have, in this case, we like to have 3 or 4 people on a tour. The more you have, the more the costs go down because you can share the costs. So in this case, we have 3 venues. We have one we had one in St. Petersburg, Florida, which was a lovely but very different presentation than this one. We have this gorgeous presentation here, and then it looks like it's going to go to Taiwan. Well, some people are interested. Yeah, well, some people are very interested, but they'll have Rodin, at a neighboring institution. They can't afford it. It doesn't fit in their schedule. There's a number of logistic things you can imagine. And there's a lot of Rodin in America. Okay, one more question. Who's it going to be? Or no one? Okay, one.
Can you speak to how he expressed emotion through his figures?
So the question was, how do I think Rodin expressed his emotion through the figures? I think this goes to a little bit of sort of what I perceive as Rodin's personality, and I was talking to both Brian and Michael about this earlier. I wrote my dissertation on Edward Manet, and he was a very witty, cool guy that you would have want to have dinner with. He was sassy and good with language, etc. I think that Rodin was a very emotional, serious guy. And I do think that actually everything you see when you look at Rodin is very much an expression of his own feelings. He's definitely feeling the feelings, and it's coming out in his work. And I think how he feels depends or determines what you see. And what's interesting is, of course, he worked a long period of time on many things. I mean, the sketches may be less so, but certainly sculpture takes a while to develop. And I think what you see there is is all a reflection of his inner self. You're welcome.